I just want to welcome Michelle. Hi, Michelle. Nice to have you join us. Thank you for being there. And I assume we have John. That's great. And Clark.
Can you hear me okay, Steve?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, good to see you.
Everybody's good.
Great.
And right. And so CTAF, you guys can stay off camera now and it'll be easier for me to see the folks on the policy roundtable, but you can jump in as needed. We'll get started in about a minute.
Just checking. Good afternoon.
Yep, you're now audible. Thank you, Kim. Sorry that happened.
Life in the Zoom lane.
All right, well, since we have all the members, let me just make sure if Elle's back. Let's see. Actually, you can go ahead and advance the slide at this point. We'll pick it back up. Good. Thank you for being back. Okay, so the long promised policy roundtable, and we are welcoming to the group of clinical experts and patient experts that we've already been working or talking with, some representatives from the payer and the manufacturer community. So again, here's the full list, alphabetically, I'm sure. But among the new folks, I'd just like them to introduce themselves. Michelle, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, happy to. Good afternoon, I think it is for everybody now. My name is Michelle Gordine. I am the Chief Medical Officer for CVS Caremark, 30+ year history in healthcare. I'm a pediatrician by training, practice in a community-based practice, 13 years of public health experience at the local and state level, and about 9 years of consulting experience as well, focused on health policy, population health, primary care, and preventive care. Spent the last 5 years before joining CVS in December as Senior Vice President and Interim Chief Medical Officer at the University of Maryland Medical System, which is a 12 hospital system in the state of Maryland. I'm really delighted to be with you this afternoon.
Oh, thank you very much. And we'll have lots of interesting questions for you to opine on. And so, again, we've met Jimmy and Pat McGann and Clark Paramore. Why don't you introduce yourself, Clark?
Thanks, Steve. Hi, I'm Clark Paramore. I'm a health services researcher, health policy analyst, and I represent the health economics, outcomes research, and market access function here at Bluebird Buyers Bank.
Thank you for joining us, Clark. And John Watkins from Primera Blue Cross. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm the Pharmacy Residency Program Director. Have been involved with ICER for a long time. I should amend the disclosure. Obviously, I have nothing to disclose other than that I work at Primera Blue Cross.
Okay, fabulous. All right, you can take down the slides, please. And Jamie, I'm sorry, but I mean, they met you during the public comment, but do you want to just briefly reintroduce yourself? Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, sure, happy to. Jamie Rubin Cahill, and I lead the Health Economics and Outcomes Research Department. I'm representing Vertex today.
Okay, so we have all the people that can fix this problem. The broad problems that we've got. We've got the insurance companies, we've got the clinical experts, we've got the patients, obviously. We've got the manufacturers. So let's get to it. Just to give you a brief overview of the hour and a half, which is not going to be enough for the richness of this topic. I want to talk a little bit at the front end about some of the broader aspects of disparities and the way that the system has been working, that the introduction of these treatments might in some way allow for new opportunities to address the broader issues that patients and families with sickle cell have faced, some unmet needs that will continue to be unmet unless something else changes. Then I want to spend a fair amount of time diving into what can feel like the weeds, but as we talk about moving forward, we're going to assume that these treatments will be approved for the sake of argument. And then we'll cover the process through which insurance companies, the hundreds of them in this country, will each go through independently to come up with its insurance coverage language. And how they do that and how some of the features of the clinical trials will or will not be used to frame that coverage policy. We'll have a broad discussion of what lessons there might be learned about how to do that right in this situation. We will certainly touch on price and payment mechanisms as part of this, because part of the broader reason we're here today, again, is to help create some guidance around the balance that we need to strike between incentives for innovation and affordability throughout the healthcare system. And we'll also touch on future research needs and any guidance we can send to good people at the FDA and others who will be part of the world in which we get future research. So with that, I would like to start again back with this question of, if each of you had to answer the question, what would key stakeholders have to do to improve the overall care of patients with sickle cell disease, and factor in now that we will have gene therapies, let's assume that that's going to happen later this year. And we'll talk about insurance coverage later, et cetera, but like, what broadly do we need to think about to get this system working better for patients and their families? And Jimmy, I know you've been already very eloquent in framing some of these broader issues around mental health. Do you want to start? And you can either talk about that again or other things, you know, and feel free to say, I really feel like doctors and hospitals have to do this, or insurance companies have to do that, or we're going to allow some gentle finger pointing during the next hour and a half and see where we can get.
Awesome. Yeah. Yeah, I would really like to start with mental health. I think it's just severely overlooked before we get into the intervention of gene therapy. Patients living with the disease are often too pigeonholed into being a physical disease, and many people overlook the mental side of how the disease can take hold of you. So I think it's vastly important that we have mental health, easily accessible mental health cases for patients pre and post transplant. I even argue that you probably need more mental health advancements or more mental help post transplant, because now that you're dealing with the less physical side of the disease, the mental side starts to actually bubble to the surface. So yeah, it's difficult. I can give you personal stories myself. Like I said, I feel like it's been severely underlooked. One story I remember quite clearly, I was a young man in my early 20s, really going through the throes of the disease. And one day I was in the midst of getting a really bad crisis, and I decided to cut my forearm, and I slashed it badly. And I kind of hit it. I wrapped a bandage around my hand and I hit it, and eventually the crisis did come. I ended up going to the hospital. I was living in New Jersey at the time. And I remember while the doctor was examining me to take care, of my pain crisis, he did see the scratches or the gashes in my arm. And he was shocked, and he was like, and I was embarrassed when he saw that. And he looked at me and he was like, did you do that? And he almost was kind of chiding me, like a little upset at me that I had done this to myself. And he said, we're going to come back and we're going to finish this discussion, and I'm actually going to have someone come over and talk to you. I ended up getting admitted. Actually, this happened while I was on the floor. And 5 days later, while I was getting discharged, no one ever came to talk to me. And I think that was the most shocking part of that specific admission, that this doctor had seen that I was going through something, admitted it, and was actually going to send some intervention my way. And 5 days later, nothing came. No one came to speak to me about it. So I think that is still happening today, in various shapes and sizes with people that have gone through gene therapies as well. It's even a lot more difficult for them to be open about their mental health issues, because they've gone, through a therapy that has, or it's potentially changing their lives. So, their mental health, they're hiding their symptoms more than anything. So that's why, I think it's really important
Oh, thank you. I can actually think of multiple reasons why that's almost like a hidden problem, especially around the gene therapies, because it could be that a lot of people assume that you get gene therapy, you're quote unquote cured, you should be ecstatic. Why would you have mental health issues now, right? You might have had them before, but now there's probably nothing to worry about. So I actually want to wonder if the clinical experts, because you could say that insurance companies should obviously cover and provide better access to coverage for mental health. But is this something that needs to get woven into the clinical protocols at transplant centers and at whoever's delivering the gene therapy? Do they need to kind of have an official default for a mental health consult or something like that? What would be the right way to address Jimmy's point, and how do we fix that?
I'm happy to comment. So I think
Sure.
living with a chronic disease, one that causes extreme pain, being a person from a marginalized background, all of these things contribute to the experiences that my patients with sickle cell face. And so if you want to provide comprehensive care, even before you even get to gene therapy, there needs to be mental health support. And then when we think about, we've been talking about, and Dr. McGann, I don't know if it was on this call or another, but beautifully illustrated that it's not a simple process. Agreeing to have gene therapy or even a transplant, the timeline is long and it can be intense. And so when you engage somebody in shared decision-making, finding out where they are, who can support them through that, I think that's also incredibly important. And so, I think the foundational care of persons with sickle cell, to Jimmy's point, even before they go through a curative therapy, has to include mental health support. And then certainly going through a very intensive process requires additional support around navigating it. And I think particularly for the age ranges that we're talking about, right, where many of these patients are in transitional points in their lives, kind of going from that school setting to being an independent young adult, to really kind of trying to find their place in life, that support is critical. And I thank you, Jimmy, for being so vulnerable and sharing that with us.
Great. Pat, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think it's important. I mean, your question is how to improve sickle cell care overall.
Yeah.
And I think while these gene therapies are exciting, they are going to impact maybe 1% of our population in the first 5 years. That would be like dramatic if we did gene therapy on 1,000 patients in the first 5 years. So we need to improve sickle cell care. Sickle cell centers need more than just hematologists. They need social workers, they need psychologists, they need community health workers, they need primary care physicians, they need all of these that individual centers like mine and Cece's are trying to do, like through our own scrappiness really, but hospital systems are not anteing up to do this. Cancer centers, hemophilia centers, cystic fibrosis centers have a lot of these resources, and sickle cell centers have not historically. There's been a lot of advocacy, including through the National Alliance of Sickle Cell Disease Centers that's starting now to say that these things are necessary, but hospital systems need to put resources into sickle cell disease as an important condition, and that just hasn't happened so far.
Okay, I think let me quickly bounce before Ella, I'm going to get to you quickly, but first I want to hear from the payers. Could you imagine, as you set up whatever network you're going to have for the centers that will do these treatments, would you imagine having a kind of criteria map that would require them to have social work or mental health some way integrated into their sickle cell, center of expertise? Is that something you could imagine, if it's not already happening, but I'm assuming it's not? Is that something you could imagine, John?
Yeah, I would assume that we would, and recalling that this is complex therapy, there are going to be states like Alaska, which we have, that won't have a center. And so in addition to what the center itself provides, I think payers need to look at making sure that we provide a package of services that assist families with these patients in getting to treatment. I learned when we started getting into gene therapy that there are concierge travel services that you can hire that will essentially put it all together for a family, which if I were in that situation as a patient or a parent, the last thing I would want is to have to worry about all that stuff. So We think a lot about remote logistics, and another issue there, of course, is reaching out and helping to get messaging out into rural areas that there may be patients out there that haven't been diagnosed even, and engaging them and getting them where they can get worked up and treated appropriately.
Great. I'm following my line of thought, so forgive me if I feel like I'm swerving a bit, but Michelle, over to you now. As a national insurer, how do you think about some of these issues around, networks, centers of excellence, and criteria for what they would need to offer, and what John raised too, which is transportation issues? How do you frame that?
Yeah, I think about it holistically. And so does our organization as well, CBS. We have an accordant care management program that's been set up for a number of rare and complex conditions, including sickle cell disease, which really embrace the sort of multidisciplinary care team approach, acknowledging that, access to therapy is important. So is access to a network of healthcare providers who have demonstrated that, they are aware and educated and adherent to the standards of care that are necessary, because we found, and this shouldn't be a surprise to anybody on the screen, all of us who have been in this space as providers or in whatever capacity as patients, that not every healthcare provider is necessarily conversant and up to speed on the latest sort of evidence-based treatment. And we believe that's really important. We've established centers of excellence that really do speak to the issue of sort of level setting on the quality of care that's needed, but also supporting that with that care management program I was talking to you about, that really does look at the whole person and provide whole person support. So the things that you were just talking about in terms of community health workers and social workers and healthcare providers, behavioral health services, we look at all of that. Are we perfect? Have we perfected all of that? No, we haven't. But I think it's important to acknowledge the fact that these types of conditions really do need that broader approach. Just imagine, I'll give you an example. When I was still at University of Maryland Medical System as Senior VP of Population Health, I talked about the fact that healthcare in general has all these wonderful providers, and we've got researchers and clinics and centers and so on and so forth, but they're fragmented. And we sort of place the individual who is burdened with the disease in the midst of all of that, metaphorically speaking, and say, all right, figure it out. Well, that shouldn't be. And the approach that we're taking at CVS is to acknowledge that individuals need individual help on their healthcare journey, and it shouldn't be left to them to sort of figure out where to go to get either medical care or the social supports or behavioral health services that are required in order to provide total support to them, and let's not forget the caregivers as well.
Yeah, I'm going to go to Al right now. I think it's fair to suggest that a lot of people think that whatever we think we're doing today to help coordinate care, broader care, for people with sickle cell, it really is not working all that well for many, many people. So whether having access to gene therapy is going to catalyze something different on the broader scale, or whether it's just going to, in some ways, accentuate it, because it could be that just the people who are already plugged into the academic centers and already are on optimal management are going to be the first up to get these, and we'll still have the vast majority of people struggling to get basic standard of care done well. So Elle, what would you want to see done differently, or more, or less?
For me, when I think about sickle cell patients and those that I've gotten to know over the years, it's so complex, and we have so many systematic problems in the healthcare system. Often when patients get gene therapy, so many other problems have already occurred in their health lives that they're still going to the hospital repeatedly. Although they may not be having vaso-occlusive crisis, they're still having many other health complications. And so on one hand, yes, it's a relief, but on the other hand, many of these patients will still have to face discrimination from people not understanding, well, if you've gotten this gene therapy done, why are you still having health complications? And I think sometimes we overlook how extensive sickle cell disease is when it comes to the life of patients as a whole. And so, yes, this one fix is going to be tremendously helpful. But on the other hand, we really have to start solving some of these problems so that we really see a change in the future, and so that patients really see more empathy when they receive care, so that they go into hospitals and don't see themselves as a burden, so that they feel like they're taken seriously and they feel like their needs are heard and understood. Many patients don't feel respected. And so what I would like to see is a healthcare system where the patients who want treatment, and even if they don't necessarily understand the science behind it, they are respected, they're treated like with dignity. And I think at the very basis of it all, everybody should be treated with dignity and love. And so that portion of care is actually missing right now. And so I would love for, as a parent, I want my child to grow up and outlive me. And right now, that seems almost impossible with the way things are. But that is my greatest hope, that parents won't bury their children who have sickle cell disease, that they will be able to see their grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and they will live healthy lives. They will see their children be able to work and have amazing careers and amazing families of their own. I think, after having the first patient in the US diagnosed in 1910, over 100 years ago, I feel like my dream is something that we should be able to attain in my lifetime, but we're not quite there yet. And with the treatment that patients receive, it feels like we haven't come very far. And so I want to see a healthcare system that pays for patients to receive care at all levels. Patients aren't always treated the same. And I think that is a burden on our society, on our communities, and it's something that we don't always talk about. Some patients are treated better than others because of their economic status. And we have to change the way people are perceived, and we have to change the way we have compassion for others. And so I just see, so many changes. The mental health piece that Jimmy talked about is crucial. It is not just for the patient themselves, but there is a mental health burden that takes place for the parents as well. Parents are experiencing PTSD because of seeing their loved ones mistreated on a scale that's unimaginable. So we have a long way to go. But I do think us having conversations like this is a start. And I feel like the fact that we recognize that there are inadequacies in our system, change is on the horizon.
Thank you, Elle. Thank you. I want to ask, I'm going to get the two manufacturers teed up because I know you guys think about the distribution of your products. Should they be approved? How will they, where will they go first? What kinds of patients and patient communities will have early access? But first, just because Elle commented on some of these broader aspects and compassion and dignity, I actually wanted to highlight John Watkins and something that I know from a story of what happened after our first report on sickle cell and your engagement in that. And again, you want to just briefly describe what happened with the pain management situation inside your health plan, and how do we learn from that experience to make it happen elsewhere?
Sure. And I always learn something from these meetings and these reports. from the patients that I didn't know. I had no idea the problem that you have going to emergency rooms and being ignored and disrespected, which shocked me because a relatively simple blood draw and tests would tell you whether you are having a sickle crisis or not. So this coincided with everybody's cracking down on opioid prescribing, which is another huge problem. And so like everybody else, we tightened our coverage policy for short-term acute opioid dispensing. And when I read the stuff about sickle cell, it suddenly hit me. We have an exception in this policy for cancer patients. Why don't we have one for sickle cell patients? And so we did that. It's a small piece, but I'm hoping that if anybody ever reads those and actually looks at that language, that they'll say, hey, I wonder why that's there. This huge education issue, and it's bigger than just sickle cell. There are several diseases I'm aware of. Multiple sclerosis is another one where patients look pretty healthy, but they're hurting on the inside and they have mental health issues as well as possibly physical symptoms like fatigue, and they don't get any respect. So this is part of a bigger problem.
Yeah. Well, again, my hope is that the introduction of paradigm changing treatments here will figure out how to use that as a catalyst to get other elements of the care addressed. Clark and then Jamie. So as you guys think a little bit also about all of these issues, obviously, but talk about your own thoughts about equity and the right things to do and how you're hopeful that your treatments, if approved, will be distributed in a way and will be managed in a way such that we really do help make them available to the patients who need them, and somehow address some of these broader structural problems and racist kind of after effects that have really made so many problems for patients. Clark, go ahead.
Sure, yeah. I mean, and obviously we're one part of the stakeholder system here, so we always have to keep that in mind. I want to circle this back, though. We said up front about the comprehensive care that's needed to even identify sickle cell patients still, as well, which is a genetic disease from birth, as well as the appropriate care. I don't believe you can have the proper decision-making on a gene therapy until you understand the patient, that the patient and the family and the clinician actually know where things stand. Some of the qualified centers, some of the centers of excellence have a better sense of that for some of their patients, but there are many individuals out there where that's not the case. So before the choice can even be made of what type of therapy, there needs to be a better base understanding. And we and others obviously are joining these coalitions to try to get better support for the comprehensive care, which some of the clinicians mentioned earlier on the call. So that's a core starting point. And then in terms of our population, Steve, again, the qualified treatment centers, as it's just part of the nature of the way these treatment therapies are managed and the populations are identified. There are going to be some early engagers that do have the hospital stays, that do have the severe disease, that are maybe a lot of them have already been tied or referred to some of these centers of excellence. They are likely going to be some of the early engagers. We know that. And then the idea is to have all this better comprehensive care so that the next set of individuals can hopefully get identified and at least have the discussion as soon as possible. So that's where I'll stop for now.
Clark, is there any role? I mean, again, you can say this is the insurer's job, but is there any role for the manufacturer to play, either in helping with transportation or any other kind of wraparound services for patients? What do you think?
Yeah, definitely. So structurally, yes, we're looking into that. I can't get into the details, but definitely we understand these structural issues, especially for this population. We understand some of the transportation and state locations and access to care in certain parts of the country. So we're trying to build our network to reflect that. I'm sure that's true of others on the call, as well as try to think of some things we can do as a company to support that within compliance. And that's some of the things we're working on.
Are those things you have to do payer by payer, or do you set up a program that's kind of payer agnostic?
Some of that has to reflect payer issues, but some of that is, of course, just broader discussions and having a core plan that we're thinking about.
Okay. Jamie, thank you for being patient. You're the last of the 8, I think, to get a chance, but go ahead.
Yeah, I think a lot of the comments have already been made. I would start back to some of the other points that were made around interactions with the healthcare system. And we actually ran some research last year where we uncovered many, and we've heard this a lot today, many patients' interaction with the healthcare systems in the emergency room. So it's not with their, hematologist who deeply understands their disease. It's in an ER where, somebody who knows nothing about sickle cell disease is, trying to manage this patient, and there's discrimination and all sorts of other under management of pain that happen within the ER. And I think that's one area. Education for the healthcare workforce to understand these types of diseases is really important as we think about moving forward. Thinking about gene therapies in particular, there's a reason that they are administered at authorized treatment centers with the knowledge and experience to deliver these complex treatments. That's a fact of these therapies. And I think one of the things that we continue to do is think forward. We know this is just the first step. And so, not every patient is going to be able to undergo this type of procedure. So we have research programs ongoing in gentler conditioning regimens and looking towards even small molecules. So I think, continuing to advance the science and the research to bring even more therapies to patients, I think is another important next step. But of course, what we have in front of us today is an important first step.
Great, thanks. Okay, I want to start to veer towards the coverage issues, which again are going to be central to a lot of people's thinkings. And again, we're months in advance of likely FDA approval, but it's already been things that payers start to think about many of these kinds of treatments months before they also anticipate FDA approval. So clinical experts, I'm going to ask some kind of challenging questions in a way, but payers are going to look at these two treatments. And the CTAF voted that, I think it was unanimous, that based on the evidence, they couldn't distinguish the clinical effectiveness between the two of them. So when this happened with hepatitis C more than a decade ago, or about a decade ago, some health plans said, you know what, we don't need every single hepatitis C treatment. We can compete them, and we can get a lower price by saying we'll only cover one, because we can use that one for pretty much everybody. So from a clinical expert perspective, is there any clinical reason that you would need to have access to both of these therapies, or could you use this one of them if for pretty much any patient?
I don't think, knowing what we know now, there's distinguishing efficacy data between them. They both seem quite effective. Safety is a little less clear. I don't think we fully know yet. I think as we have more data, it will be important to allow patients to sort of think about it. I heard, I think it was Jimmy say that he chose specifically the product that did not include a lentivirus. Some might have other problems with CRISPR or whatever. So I think it would be, if we have therapies, it would be nice to have options for patients. Realistically, my sense is that there won't be as much choice, and centers will have one or the other for complicated reasons. But if we have good products and there are some nuanced differences between them, it would be nice to have them all available.
Is it better from a quality control perspective for a center of excellence to have one, in terms of knowing everything about and having one system that never varies in terms of how it's delivered and used and monitored? Or again, are they so quote unquote interchangeable that it really doesn't matter if you've got two or three or whatever?
I don't know that we have enough information yet about whether or not one product is superior to be able to make that determination. When you think about like infrastructure, cell processing, how we collaborate in delivering care, I think that I would still support Dr. McGann said, and having the option to have all available therapies is what I think would be most desirable.
What if I told you could get 50% discount if you only had one? Would that change your mind? No, I'm not going to ask you that question.
I'm not a health system administrator, so
I'm not going to ask you that question.
Yeah.
That's what they got out of hepatitis C. They got a 50% break by saying we'll only cover one. Now, I'm not suggesting that that's the right way. I'm just suggesting that this is going to be part of the thought process by payers as they address what are going to be very, very expensive treatments. And for the first time ever, really, there's going to be the possibility, at least, of competition between two gene therapies. So everybody's going to be wondering, what do we do with this space? John, what's your what's your take on not how Premera necessarily will do it, but how do you think payers will approach this question?
Yes, obviously, they're going to think about what you just said. And I think it's a question of how much you can potentially save. If you tell me I can get it for half the price it would be otherwise, I can't not do that. And certainly in a commercial market, which we primarily are in, and the majority of our patients with sickle cell disease are covered by large employers, they will be very unhappy if we don't take that. And I think, and you're going to get to the issue of global affordability later, I'm sure, but I think we need to just stop thinking about our own plan and our own provider group or whatever, and think about the global impact. You've seen oncologists are starting to do that more, and I think we need to go there.
Okay. Michelle, again, as a national insurer, you may have different thoughts on how you'll just generally look at the whole issue of having two competitive agents now, or let's assume you do. Anything you'd like to add about how you think you and other national insurers will think through that process of excluding one from the formulary, for instance?
Yeah, absolutely. A number of thoughts. This has been such a great conversation. Looking at it from a number of different perspectives. First, in terms of the plan sponsors who, we as a pharmacy benefits management company, Caremark, support, cost is first and foremost. And so from our perspective, you've got a treatment which is potentially life-changing, curative, with a high upfront cost. How do you, and this is something that we've been thinking about, how do you shape the conversation around ROI for plan sponsors that say, hey, wait, this is like really expensive. I don't know if we can afford to cover this and all the other drugs that we cover. What's the potential? These are some unanswered questions down the line to reduce medical and pharmacy spend. How does that play into the ROI equation? What's the actual cost, for example, of lifetime cost of sickle cell? We got into that a bit earlier. I was on and had to jump off for a meeting and jump back, but the person who was presenting the economic data, taking a look at that holistically is something I'd be interested in, not just the medical cost, but the psychosocial costs, the costs of, for example, I'm a pediatrician, delays in development of children with sickle cell disease, the cost of missed school and work, the cost of reduced productivity and ability to provide for the family. How does all of that come into play to sort of counter the cost of the drug? From a medical affairs perspective, the team that I oversee at Caremark, we're always surveying the drug pipeline in general. We tend to believe that more than one drug in a particular category generates competition, which theoretically can drive costs down. It's important for us to understand and review the evidence, the literature, clinical guidelines, the FDA label when it comes out, to ensure that what we are recommending from a clinical appropriateness perspective is just that. And so those are the things that we look at and that we provide to the other parts of our team in terms of consideration. That's really baseline before we even get to talk about cost. Is the drug safe? Is it clinically appropriate? Is it effective? And for whom? And then is it cost effective? Because we understand that cost, and Steve, you led with that data this morning. Cost is a huge factor. It really influences the ability to be able to access these therapies and realize the potential reduction in disease burden. So all of that comes into play. So one, the clinical considerations, safety, efficacy, appropriateness, the cost implications to the plan sponsors and how to shape that ROI discussions so that it holistically encompasses both sides of that equation are what we will be considering.
That's a good broad picture. And I mean, again, just for general context, even though we've been talking about relatively small numbers of patients likely being eligible or getting it, I should say, in the first few years, there's a trend towards smaller employers in particular feeling that they may not be able to afford health insurance for their employees if the premiums go up. And there's a growing number of them who are deciding to X out coverage for any cell or gene therapy. And I honestly don't believe that anybody feels like that's a good outcome. I don't think the small employers do. I don't think large insurers do. I don't think certainly patients and clinical experts, nobody. And yet that is part of the reality that people are struggling with. So every time people say, well, we have to be thoughtful about the costs, it's not just to always in any way to pad bottom lines or to whatever. It is in some ways meant to try to avert a crisis. And we'll talk more about different ways to pay for expensive one-time therapies, but it's a real thing.
Right.
Clark and Jamie, the standard soapbox talking point is we want all treatments covered by all insurers for every patient who's appropriate. People will be looking to you guys though, because competition is supposed to sometimes provide efficiencies, but it also leads to different ways to try to market your products to patients and to clinicians. So I'm not sure I can actually ask a question in a way that would seem fair to you guys, but I could just imagine a future in which there's messaging going out to patients that one of these options chops up your DNA, whereas ours just slides in a nice smooth gene fix. And the other side could say ours is a nice clean scissors, whereas theirs sticks a virus into your bone marrow and infects you with things that could cause cancer. No one's going to obviously have any kind of public messaging that way. But I think that there's going to be a really important role for the companies and for clinical experts to not let this competition lead to patients making decisions based on what might seem not a real basis. And I hesitate to say that, but Pat or Cece, have you already grappled a little bit? I mean, you haven't yet because you don't have access to both of these, but can you see a way that we can frame a recommendation around the way that the system should handle the fact that with competition can come messaging that could confuse patients or make it difficult for them to have true shared decision-making with you?
Well, a couple of thoughts. So Steve, I'm hoping that competition actually is more like co-opetition where they're positively feeding off one another and getting better rather than it being something that turns out to be too negative. I think in the chat, Joanna also brought up the importance of health education before starting these therapies, which I think is what you're alluding to as well, and how we present the information to our patients, are able to meet them at wherever the health literacy level is, and help them to make the decision that's best. I really think it's probably going to come down to what's available at our center. But I think there's a great role for improving, health literacy and education. And then ultimately, to Jamie's point earlier, this is a first step, and looking forward to future steps that really help to refine what we're able to present. Okay,
thanks. Well, let me jump forward. I'm going to have to keep my eye on the clock. And now I'm going to jump into, again, what may feel like a really robotic approach. But the way that payers create their coverage criteria to help decide which patients qualify for coverage, they usually follow a kind of a script. And it looks a little bit like the FDA label, but it has certain categories and now they're going to have to figure out, let's assume that they're covered by the FDA, approved by the FDA. The FDA may create a label that's fairly broad, and yet insurers often have to take that language and figure out how to make very specific kind of definitions and other things to help decide who should and who shouldn't get coverage. So I'm going to start with age, and we'll move from there. So right now, the trials that are being used for FDA consideration start at age 12. There are trials in the field for children younger than that. But so far, I don't believe any data are in the public domain, and I don't believe that they're likely to be made part of the FDA approval package, but I could be wrong. So an insurer now looking at the existing data would say, I'm only going to cover it for people who are older than age 12 as a starting point. Clinical experts, is that going to create an early bind where you're going to want to have patients considered who are under the age of 12?
Yes and no, I think. I think the age should be expanded. We've learned from the transplant experience that the earlier you do these therapies, the better off things are. And so it makes sense to do things before organ damage and chronic complications of sickle cell begin much beyond the age of 12. Age 12 is a very arbitrary age range. That being said, a lot of our young patients are managed these days very well with hydroxyurea, and I don't have too many concerns that I can keep patients in reasonably good health until age 12. But I have families who are interested in a curative therapy, and they wouldn't be able to get it. So I would hope that the age were more expanded either now or in the not too distant future, because there would be patients that would benefit from it.
Just a quick comeback question. My understanding is that at some age, there's concern that their pulmonary and perhaps other organ systems aren't up to the bone marrow transplant part of the overall therapy. And so that would be from the clinical expert's perspective, you're obviously thinking about that with every patient, but is there a conceptual reason to worry about patients under the age of, let's say, 12 for now, that they're at higher risk of those side effects from just the transplant?
Not that I'm aware of. No, I don't think so. I think the risk is probably worse when you get older and you have more damage to your liver or more other organ damage types of things.
Okay. Cece, any comment there?
Yeah, I would agree. I agree with that.
Okay, so stay tuned. There's likely, again, it would be extremely unlikely, given the way the world works, for payers to not accept the FDA's age cutoff as their cutoff. So we'll see what happens. And it's possible for the FDA to ignore the eligibility criteria for the studies. They do that sometimes with rare diseases. But in this case, well, we'll just have to wait and see. Okay, let me drop down then into the clinical eligibility criteria, which go along with things like what are called inclusion criteria, like what would get you potentially covered, and then exclusion criteria, what might you have that would exclude you from being considered for coverage. And again, the usual course for payers is to see if there are any clinical guidelines out there from the specialty societies, and then to look at the FDA label and the eligibility and exclusion criteria from the pivotal trials of the studies. And I'm looking at those right now. And I tried to look at them and think, okay, where are the questions going to arise around how to translate the trial eligibility into insurance coverage? Because they can just cut and paste. And that's actually, that happens not a fair amount of, not rarely. But let's go through some of this. First off, they all have to be diagnosed with genetic testing. And I'm just going to, again, get a quick confirmation that these days that patients will have a full genetic test done as just part of their standard of care.
Yeah, most states have newborn screen, and then we also confirm through electrophoresis regularly.
Okay. Now there's one genotype that we talked about earlier this morning. Again, we'll just briefly cover because insurers will be confused a bit because the way that sickle cell disease is defined for lovo-cel is different. The genetic subvariants are different than the trial for exa-cel. There is one genetic variant, the beta sickle and the beta plus genotype, which was included in the lovo-cel eligibility criteria and was not included in the exa-cel criteria. So the question to the plans are going to be, what do we do with this? Do we have different coverage for different gene therapies, or, what is this one genotype that sticks out as a difference between the two? And can you just, again, briefly help educate everybody about whether that's a meaningful genotype and how plans should interpret that, the fact that it's only in one trial but not in the other?
Sure. So there's several different types of sickle cell disease based on what mutations are present. There's 2 genes. Everyone has 2 genes for every trait, including sickle cell disease. When you have both S mutations, you have SS disease, which is about 70% of the US population. SC, meaning you have the S mutation on one gene and the C mutation on the other, allele rather. And those are easily distinguishable. When you combine S with beta thalassemia mutations, there are hundreds of different mutations on the beta globin gene that either knock out entirely, called beta 0 or beta null mutations. Hemoglobin A or normal hemoglobin, that's called hemoglobin S beta 0 thalassemia, where you only produce hemoglobin S. That's very similar to hemoglobin SS, and that should be included. Beta plus thalassemia, which is what you're talking about. There's heterogeneity based on the genetic mutation. Some have minor mutations in the beta globin gene that cause an extremely mild phenotype. Others have a more severe mutation that has a more severe phenotype. So, and these are, small, relatively small numbers, less than 5%, 10% probably of our whole population, but still there are some patients with S beta plus thalassemia who have a lot of symptoms. There may be something to the technology when you have different genes involved of how you edit those genes and why that was selected. I don't know that for sure, but I think genotype will have to be importantly described in the label, and there might be something from the manufacturers about why they would or would not want to use certain genotypes.
Unless one of the manufacturers does want to jump in, I would suggest that we're going to talk about phenotype. That's a fancy word for how severe the disease is and the patient's lived experience as the more important threshold for deciding how the coverage will be determined, yes or no. But if you did have any specific comment you wanted to say about that particular genotype.
I think it's, as you were saying, Steve, the phenotype is the more important aspect to look at.
Okay, so if I'm a health plan, I could include beta sickle beta plus, and if I have a severity threshold, I'm not going to be roping in a bunch of patients in a sense who wouldn't be considered eligible for either gene therapy. So that was kind of my point. Okay, so now let's tackle the really thorny issue. And this comes up whether we're talking about atopic dermatitis or COPD or heart failure. It's sometimes the drug is approved for severe cases. And all of a sudden the health plan gets to decide or should decide, what does that mean? Do they let the doctor decide what's severe and they don't really check anything? Or do they have very, very clear criteria for what makes something severe? Now, if you're dealing with a $2 a day treatment, it's unlikely you're going to worry about that much unless there are real side effects, et cetera, that you do want to be very careful with. But in a $1 to $2 million treatment, let's say, I think there's going to be a lot of attention paid to how insurers use the clinical trial eligibility criteria to decide who's eligible. So let me just say that first off, it is different between the two treatments because they use different definitions, and we'll get back to that as a general kind of philosophy. But just to know that right now I'm looking at lovo-cel first. So they have to have appropriate supportive care measures. That means pain management plans, and have experienced at least 4 severe VOEs in the 24 months prior to informed consent. Now, they have a different definition in the trial for severe VOE. That is an event with no medically determined cause other than vaso-occlusion. It requires more than 24 hours stay in the hospital or emergency room, or at least 2 visits to a day unit or ER over 72 hours, with both visits requiring IV treatment. John, you see that in the clinical trial eligibility criteria. The FDA label approves this for severe sickle cell disease. What are you going to do? Oh, sorry, you're on mute.
There we go, sorry. I think you'll see considerable payer variation in that. You mentioned atopic dermatitis as a comparator. That's a different situation, and often with the things we have now, you're looking at current severity of the disease, whereas with this one, as a clinical pharmacist with internal medicine background, I am concerned about the long-term damage. And so I'm going to be more concerned. I might want to treat a patient that is a little less severe in terms of current symptoms, but maybe has more possibility for downstream effects. And I don't know how to answer that question. This is where we basically look to clinical expertise. We're going to find, in this case, it probably means going to the local children's hospital and finding out who the experts for this population are, and then we will consult them. And that's what I would advise doing. I think you're going to see payers all over the map.
Just to be right, just to pick out a theme there, which is with a new treatment like these, health plans will very often, well, they always involve their own clinical experts to a certain extent, but there might be a lot of variation in what they hear from clinical experts around the country. So with two of our favorite clinical experts here with us today, you're advising a health plan ABC, and they say, the natural thing for me to do is just to use this language, and I'm going to require that they document this 24-hour hospital stay or at least 2 visits over 72 hours. That's what we would usually do. Am I being clinically inappropriate to do that? That would probably be the first question they ask. Is there any reason that that's the wrong thing to do?
So no. I think I was just thinking a little bit about Michelle's comment earlier and thinking about the lifetime costs of sickle cell disease, though. And I'm certain, though, my opinion is that is more than sufficient, especially when I think about our patients like Jimmy or caregivers like Elle. I also understand that a payer may be also thinking about how can we quantitatively understand value in this sense.
Can I ask you a tricky question, I think? And Pat, feel free to jump in and interrupt me because I skipped right over you there. But okay, I'm a patient and I have worked really hard with you, either of you, to control my pain crises and to do the best I can. And I'm pretty stoic for lots of reasons. I don't like going to the ER, et cetera, et cetera. So I have not been to the ER twice in the last year. I manage it at home. I'm tough, whatever labels you want to put on this. And that's probably inappropriate of me to call it tough, but I have managed to keep out of the healthcare system's way to qualify, but I want to be considered for gene therapy. Do I then have to just say, okay, fine, next time I have any pain, I'm just going to go into the ER, so then I'll qualify? Is that going to be part of the process here? And insurers, feel free to chime in, because this is an old issue of whether you make thresholds and then patients and doctors who feel like they want to get the treatment will figure out how to meet that threshold. What do we think is going to happen?
We know, the literature would support, especially in our adults, that they do experience daily chronic pain. There's published data about home pain diaries that patients experience. And so we know that, a lot of the pain that persons with sickle cell experience is at home. Mm-hmm. I think trying to sort out how to provide this treatment to patients who desperately need access is the tricky part of your question. So I'm interested in what
Pat, what would you say?
Yeah, I think a little bit differently. I actually very much dislike these types of criteria. Sickle cell disease is a serious, life-threatening chronic condition. Hydroxyurea is a very good medicine, but is a Band-Aid, really, that they need to take their whole life. Elle explained nicely about how, and I've heard from some of my parents of patients who are doing great on hydroxyurea on the surface. Their labs look good, they're out of the hospital, but that family is still affected by sickle cell disease every single day. And if they have a therapy that is potentially able to remove that burden for them, they wouldn't be eligible unless they stopped their hydroxyurea and got super sick, which is silly, and not silly, it's terrible and not necessary. Even when we started using hydroxyurea, there was criteria. You would wait till there was 3 pain crises or 2 acute chest syndrome or something, and now we just use it all the time. And I think I have patients like you described, patients who have clear burden from sickle cell disease, but wouldn't meet the criteria or can't get into the clinical trials because they don't fit those things. But if we have this therapy that truly can potentially clinically cure sickle cell disease. I frankly think a diagnosis of the severe genotypes of sickle cell disease should be the only criteria that's needed without the rest.
All right, that's a strong statement, and I want to pause on that. Michelle, and because again, some of us know how, this has happened with other treatments through time, but you just heard from a clinical expert that the genotype is enough. You don't need to put in some kind of severity threshold to qualify to do the right thing clinically by these patients. And this is obviously, again, a context in which we have years of discrimination and other aspects of inadequate care and access. How do you think insurers will factor that perspective in, that you should not have thresholds for severity?
Yeah, Steve, I think it really is too early to be able to answer that question. I understand the intent behind it. What I can say is this: typically, what we do as a pharmacy benefits management company and devising criteria is pay very close attention and adhere very closely to the evidence and what the evidence demonstrates. Clinical appropriateness is really foundational for us. We also acknowledge the history of sickle cell disease. I certainly, as a pediatrician and African-American woman, acknowledge that as well. And so in terms of the ability to be able to ensure appropriate access as broadly as is appropriate is going to be our goal, adhering to that evidence, adhering to the FDA guidelines, et cetera. And by the way, we do also not only rely on internal experts, but consult external experts as well, and rely on that information in order to determine where we're going to land. But right now, it's really too early to be able to say where we're going to land with that.
Oh, of course. And forgive me if I implied that I wanted you to tell me where you were landing. It's more, I think there's going to be real wrestling in the insurance world in considering whether they can let go of a severity threshold.
For sure.
Yeah. So there's no, unfortunately, I don't think there's going to be a clear answer on that. And there will be likely a fair amount of variation across payers, which again, some people will think that's the way it is. We have multiple payers and we shouldn't always expect the same thing, but it could create a lot of discontent. A couple other that I just need to walk through quickly so we can get to some other important big picture issues. But the next on this list of clinical is kind of a step therapy question, which is to get into the trial, you have to have had, an adequate course of hydroxyurea and had all of these episodes on top of being adequately treated with hydroxyurea. So I'm assuming, again, hydroxyurea, as you said, Pat, is kind of, and Cece, this is what you would start your patients on. It's kind of really is standard of care. Do you have any concerns about a payer saying you've got to document that you've had an adequate course of hydroxyurea before consideration for coverage for a gene therapy?
I'm not that worried. Most patients will have received that, I think.
Okay. All right. Do you have any concern that exclusion criteria say that if you have a willing HLA identical sibling, you should not be eligible for coverage for these gene therapies? That also is in black and white, and a lot of plans will look at it and just say, okay, so they have to document that they don't have an HLA matched sibling. Is that going to happen? John, why don't you advise on this? Do you think that payers will include that exclusion criteria?
I'm sure some will. I would have thought about it this morning, but after hearing what I've just heard, I think right now, especially in a world that's just been through a devastating pandemic and is looking at the possibility of others, the issue of long-term immunosuppressive therapy, I think would move my needle personally.
Okay, that's an interesting point. Clinical experts, any from a clinical expert perspective, again, as I understand, that has been, if they have a matched sibling, that would be the standard of care currently. But as John said, would you want insurers to consider covering it, even if they did have a matched sibling for the reason of long-term suppression?
I think it's important for all patients to be able to have the option. So I would not make that an exclusion criteria.
Okay. By the way, what percent of patients are likely, is this known, like just on average, what percent of patients have a matched sibling? Am I just being forgetful of all my medical school training? Is it 25% when I
Less than 20%, I think. It's low. I think it's less than 20% is the number.
Okay. All right, Pat, you mentioned this also, I believe it was this morning, I forget when, I'm sorry, but among the other exclusion criteria, it's patients who've had a stroke, any history of severe cerebral vasculopathy. It does say, though, that subjects with radiographic evidence of a silent infarction who aren't, in a sense, having severe vasculopathy now are eligible. But do you want, because again, a lot of payers may not have more expertise and they may just look at that and kind of cut and paste. Do you want to say anything about whether patients with a history of stroke should be considered eligible?
Yeah, I think it would be a huge fail if they're not. These group of patients are the ones that are the primary patients who are receiving chronic blood transfusions, exchange transfusions, and again, from an expense to the system. I have a young patient who is 7 who has had a stroke, and she's going to need exchange blood transfusions every 4 weeks for the rest of her life, and will probably be in pretty good health. That's pretty expensive to the system, I imagine. And she wouldn't be eligible, which would be problematic. I think this was nuances of clinical trial design, but I think this group of patients would be at the top of my list to go to gene therapy. So it would be unfortunate and really a mistake to exclude them.
Okay. Jimmy and Elle, I have circled rapidly through these insurance coverage issues and focused really the conversation among the insurers, clinical experts, and a little bit with the manufacturers. But is there anything that you've heard as we've discussed these different points that you wanted to comment on before I shift over to talk about pricing and payment?
Yes. So I was just listening about hydroxyurea being an exclusion factor, and I was thinking about my own daughter and our situation. She doesn't just have sickle cell disease; she also has another disease that actually prevents her from taking hydroxyurea. And I know that she's not the only patient like that. And so I've shared that my daughter right now isn't eligible, although her doctor would want her to be eligible for gene therapy, but because of those exclusion criteria, she's not. And so as a parent that's in that situation right now, I am very concerned that that would be one of the criteria that could exclude other families from getting gene therapy.
Okay, thank you. So noted. Jimmy, sorry.
For me, it's just that there's too many exclusionary criteria. The goals should be to try and make this more accessible. And obviously, this probably shows my lack of understanding for the healthcare system. But I feel like when you're going through these clauses or criteria, it's by definition not making the therapy accessible. In the perfect world, I think one, we need as many options as possible. And two, if you have sickle cell, you have access to a gene therapy. That should be, what the therapy should look like in the perfect world. But obviously we don't live in one.
Well, but well said. Well said. Okay, now let's talk about price and payment, because if there isn't partial answer to your question, it's because of the cost that people will want to, again, if there's a positive vision of that circle I drew in that kind of slide earlier, it's that we have to think about the potential for it to be used. But as your point is that it won't be overused, certainly, but at this price, it could still have an impact. Now, we're not talking about hundreds of thousands of people using this, obviously, but Clark and Jamie, you guys are now front and center. I hope you've benefited from this mini advisory board in which we've talked with clinical experts and payers, and you guys have now so now your turn to hopefully contribute to our thinking. All right, national television, microphone in your face. How much does it cost, the cost of goods and services, to make your product? So not the research and development that happened over the years, but when it gets approved, what's the marginal cost of cranking this out for an individual patient? Ballpark would be fine, but what do you think?
Yeah, I don't know if you want to go first, Jamie. I'm not gonna be able to speak to that or speculate to that, Steve.
Yeah,
Oh,
same.
Clark,
Sorry.
Clark. All right,
I'm
I
honest
see.
with you usually, so I try.
No,
to be.
I know. I mean, somewhere in your company that's probably known, but I've
But
seen
but I thought we were going to discuss the value-based price.
Oh no, we are. I'm gonna say that it's rare that people talk about the cost of actually making it as the reason it should be priced in a certain way. On the other hand, there have been some things in the public domain saying that gene therapies cost somewhere between $500,000 to $1 million just to produce, not to research and develop, not to try other things that failed along the way, nothing else, but literally just to crank it out on a one-by-one basis. And I have no idea whether that's true or not. And I have no idea whether that's an average. I have no idea whether it applies to your products. But I was just curious if you did have any gut sense or something internal on the ballpark for that number. Jamie, anything?
Yeah, I can't comment on the number specifically, but I would remind you that these are, highly precision medicine. We are, using the patient's own cells and editing them. And so, as you can imagine, that is quite a complex process, as you alluded to.
Right. But is it fair also to say that you guys won't price your treatment as a multiple of the amount of money it costs to make it? It's not like you guys have a formula where you say, if it costs $100, we're going to charge $2.5 times the manufacturing cost to come up with our price. That's not how you guys go about it, right?
I mean, I think the value of the products is very different from that. And that's very important here on a few fronts. I think the first is, the lifetime cost of sickle cell disease, which are out there, are, upwards of $4 to $6 million over the lifetime of a patient. And what, we've seen so far in the elimination of these severe vaso-occlusive events and therefore, continued other benefits that, on complications and other areas, I think that is important to remember just as we think about the cost of the disease today. And that's just one part of the equation. The other part is, what does this mean for people who are treated? And I think we also heard that today, which is also extremely important. So, no, I don't think anybody just has some magic formula like that. There is a tremendous value that these treatments bring to the lives of patients and to society. And I think that is something that's really important to remember as we're thinking about these gene therapies and gene therapies as a whole.
Right. So, John or Michelle, weave you in. So just again, conceptually, I know we talked a little bit about the possibility of there being competition and maybe picking one or the other, but in general, let's assume there was one gene therapy for sickle cell disease, and you're negotiating across the table from one of these two companies. Can you walk away from the table if they ask for too much money? What happens if they ask for $10 million, for $20 million?
So
Could you?
I think
Go ahead,
one of the
Michelle.
things that's important to sort of consider is, at least from a PBM perspective, one of the things that we provide is access to a market that needs the pharmaceutical that they have developed. And so in the process of the negotiation, which, full disclosure, I am not the negotiator who does that, but certainly in terms of considering both sides, we want to keep front and center access to therapy for a condition that, for as others have stated, more than a century has been woefully lacking. And quite frankly, just in terms of the ability to be able to get that product in front of individuals, it would be important to keep that in mind at the negotiating table.
Okay, that sounds like you just handcuffed yourself and said, "I'll pay whatever you ask because it's important to me."
That's not what I said at all.
That's
Steve.
not what you said. Okay, don't worry. Nothing goes down into print until much later. I'm kidding. So I'm drawing out some of these what seem like maybe facetious questions because it reflects a consistent theme of these meetings and of the U.S. healthcare system, which is we celebrate innovation, as I said at the very outset of the meeting, and yet we also need to seek a balance, and that balance can come through different means. But let's assume that this is a therapy for which we have special reason to want to provide it to as many patients, like Jimmy said, to as many patients who have sickle cell disease who might want it and benefit from it. I'll ask the insurers a question, but manufacturers, given this societal almost mandate that we get this right, do you guys have a social mandate in some way to price the drug lower than you could? Or is that somehow not right because your shareholders would string you up?
I just think, so Jamie, I'm sorry, I'll jump in here first. I think the value-based price is the appropriate way to consider this. We are one stakeholder. We are not the only stakeholder to make that decision, which would put more pressure, right? If it was, oh, the stakeholder has to be the manufacturer to do this. I mean, yeah, in my view, that makes no sense. We are one stakeholder. Our job is to hopefully bring innovation, especially to this population that has not had anything up to this level, or even treatments that are even less than this level by a good degree, in my view. Our job is to bring a value-based price, bring it to the market, work with payers, work with the system, including Medicaid, to try to think through better ways for access. There's a lot of rules that are out there that could be followed better. We may get into that. There's a lot of things we can do in the current system, but still raise the issue of does the broader system need to adjust and change for these therapies, which I know we've discussed for 6 years, 7 years. So that's my answer for that.
We're going to zip through some of the payment mechanism options that can help manage very high one-time costs in just a second. But Jamie, if you wanted to respond, I wanted to give you a chance to.
Yeah, I would just agree with Clark, and I think it's a bit of a euphemism to say like higher than you could. I wouldn't even know kind of what that is. I think again back to the value of these products and what they are bringing to patients and society is sort of what we're rooted in. I don't think anybody's trying to do anything nefarious here. This is a really important disease. Many people have said today, we've known the cause of this disease for many, many decades. And, just now we have these types of gene therapies, to provide. And I think that, as you said, is something to be celebrated. And I think we're all committed to working together in this ecosystem to ensure that patients have access to these important treatments.
Well, there's a tension there that, as you know, is part of why people will be discussing what a fair price is, why Medicare and Medicaid are trying to figure this out in a variety of different ways. Cece, I promised that I'd come back to your paper and to the basic idea. I framed it the reverse. Should our special sense that we want to address disparities mean that we should price lower because that will help access? Other people could say, actually, that means we should pay more because we want these treatments to help address disparities. On the other hand, the price isn't a given. It's not set by how much it costs to make or anything else. It's a choice. And so it's an interesting question about whether our societal urge to do the right thing here should lead to a drug that we would want to be more expensive or could be more expensive. Now, you did an academic paper. We don't have time to get into the details, but because you've been thinking about this from a variety of different perspectives, I wondered if you had any comment.
I think you are an expert question asker, Steve. I think you're very precise. And so the paper that you're talking about used distributional cost effectiveness, which considers equity weights, and I'm trying to understand whether or not a certain intervention is cost effective. And the question there is trying to understand, given the cost that it's at, not determining the cost, does it add value or is it worth it? And, we found, yes, that gene therapy for sickle cell disease is. That is not a comment on current pricing. It's taking the inputs that we have now, the cost that we have now, and making a determination.
I highly recommend this Annals of Internal Medicine paper to you all because it's a brilliant way to pose a question with good evidence. It creates a threshold effect for how much we as a country would want to prefer paying a higher price for something that would lead to more equitable health outcomes across our society. And I really I want to champion the work that you and your colleagues did on that paper. Well done. Okay. So unfortunately, that's not going to solve our problems. It poses a good question. I have a little schematic here of all the things that people have said. Here's what we can do to help with the very high one-time price. And ICER, we have our own white paper on this. A lot of people have been thinking about it. Nothing seems to be solved yet. So I want to turn to Clark and Jamie and say, to what extent do you want to talk at this point about any prospective discussions you've had around ways that you think payers can pay for this that will help modulate the budget impact? So budget impact, you can either do that with reinsurance or stop loss. That basically says if, in the insurance system, they buy like supplemental insurance for themselves. And if the cost goes too high, they're kind of covered by a third party. You could set up a structure where they pay you. I'm just going to pick that number, $2 million out of a hat. Please do not suggest to anybody that I think that's the right price or the wrong price. But you could pay it in installments like a mortgage. Okay, we recognize that value. We just don't want to pay it all up front. We might want to track to see if the durability is what we hope for. On the other hand, we could have a lower price, at least at the beginning, because of the additional uncertainty we have right now. This is the first gene therapy for more than a relatively very small set of patients. And I know we've talked about relatively small numbers using it in the short term, but subscription models where you would come to a payer or a state or a region and say, we'll cover for all the patients with sickle cell who want this treatment, we'll give you a one price for as many as you can bring in and get, lined up to get treated, as a way to handle some of the uncertainty around this. And then we can talk about government carve-outs too. I mean, Medicaid is trying to figure out whether they should have a kind of a more centralized negotiation process around cell and gene therapies. Some people have even suggested that the private insurance market is not well set up for these really high-priced one-time treatments when patients move around to different insurers and everything. And maybe we need to carve this out and say it's like renal dialysis, and the federal government covers your cure for sickle cell, and it's part of Medicare. You get automatic Medicare coverage if you have sickle cell for this treatment. So all of these different ideas, from reinsurance to installment payments, even all the way to a government carve-out, and subscription kind of arrangements. Jamie, I'll start with you this time. Are you guys coming forward with any of these ideas to the payers? Because they usually wait to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, so obviously I can't comment on confidential ongoing discussions with payers, but we have been engaged on this topic for a while. We've been doing a lot of listening, and I think you kind of hit the nail on the head. There is not going to be a one-size-fits-all approach for every single payer. Stakeholders have different interests, different views, and we are committed to remaining flexible to ensure that all patients have access to these therapies. That's our number one goal, and I think flexibility is key because, saying we're going to do only one thing is not listening to what we've heard. I'd also just remind you that this is a rare disease, that is, for a group of patients with severe disease. And so, I think even though it might be larger than some of the other disease areas where, you've had gene therapies in the past, we're not talking about hundreds of thousands of people getting these treatments, certainly at all, especially in the first couple of years. So just to keep that in mind as well, we're not talking about hundreds of thousands of people. So I would just remind you of the size of the patient population as well as we think about this.
Thanks. If I had to force you to pick one of those items from the menu that you're hearing the most about, that you think is going to be more likely to be the most common among all of those approaches, which would you say?
I would say, again, flexibility is key. I'm not sure that there is one. I think that even there's varieties within varieties, as you can imagine, Steve. So it's not, this isn't like, oh, this one thing is what we've heard 50% of, the payers we've engaged with want. It's not like that. I would say remaining flexible is the key here to ensure that patients have access to this medicine, and we're committed to that.
All right, Clark?
No, so agree with a lot of that. We obviously have had experience in a different way with some outcomes agreements we already have in place with payers, Spores, and Teglo. Different disease, different ways you would even consider how to do that. Different makeup, as Jamie said, in terms of population and what's there. So we're continuous conversations. We use that experience in those conversations. We've learned a lot in the last year as we've had some of that experience with payers, but still lots more to learn, especially with, again, the different population and different disease areas. So we're open. We are committed to the concept of putting our money where our mouth is with an outcomes agreement, but the details, all of that is forthcoming.
I kind of use this as a trailer almost, with apologies, because ICER and our policy leadership forum are working this year on an update to our white paper on cell and gene therapy that's going to do a really deep dive into these other alternative payment mechanisms and talk a lot about what's been learned so far in the market. But everybody recognizes that sickle cell is going to be a pivotal moment in this, and a lot of payers are going to want some kind of arrangement that helps them manage the combination of budget impact and uncertainty. And so I'm not surprised that there will be some variations. I just hope that we can learn from the process and ultimately, again, create a system that can be affordable to the states and other payers who are going to bear a lot of the burden here. Michelle or John, anything you'd want to add on real quickly to that comment of where you guys are in your thinking? Or you could not even say about this gene therapy, but anything that you want to share about gene therapies and your approach to these alternative mechanisms?
I'll just add one quick point, and that is from an actuarial perspective, the purpose of insurance is to spread risk. And so as long as you have a large enough pool to spread it over, you're good. But this is only the beginning, and there's a whole queue of these therapies coming. So I'm afraid even if we carve it out to the federal government, which, by the way, Medicare, as we all know, is going bankrupt in the foreseeable future. If we carve it out there, there's going to reach a point where there is no pool big enough to spread the risk. So sooner or later, you're going to get there. I don't know how soon, but something to think about.
Okay, Michelle, real briefly, if you can, if you have a comment.
Sure, yeah, just really want to express appreciation for this conversation. I mean, Steve, you've done a masterful job of sort of raising all of the considerations that are yet to be contemplated. But I think it sounds like we all agree on this call of the tremendous opportunity that these therapies present, in addition to sort of the holistic way of thinking about treatment. Want to express gratitude also to the two patient experts as well. You guys are awesome. So thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. Praise to me is useless because I've done a bad job of doing my primary job, which is to make sure that we gave you all as much time as possible without running down the clock too much. I'm going to have to leave some of these issues on the cutting room floor. And what we always do at the end of our policy roundtables is invite each of you to make a final statement. And it always is asked to be one sentence. And this can be one sentence that is just your bumper sticker headline that you want throbbing in people's ears as they leave the meeting. It can also be a request of something that you would ask of one of the other stakeholders at the table that you think is the most important thing that they could do to improve the scene, either for innovation, for fair access, or for fair pricing. So think about that. We're going to let the patients have the last word. So one sentence, and please be brief even within that sentence if you can. And I'd like to start with John.
I think it's an amazing opportunity. It's something we've been waiting for a long time for a very needy population. So we just have to figure out how to make this work.
Thank you. Michelle?
I think just to piggyback on what I said, this really does raise hope to reduce disease burden for a population that has been waiting for far too long.
Thank you. Jamie?
Yeah, and I'm getting the sense that we will all commit to ensuring that patients have rapid access to these transformative therapies because they've been waiting a long time, and a life free of VOCs is is really important as we look to the future.
Thank you. Clark.
Yeah, I would just like to clarify, I view this as a great, important challenge and not a problem, as something has been used, not, in a friendly way, Steve. I think it's a great challenge for us and not necessarily a problem. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Pat?
One sentence is tough. Sickle cell patients have been failed for generations, and it's going to be a tremendous disappointment if arguments over price and dollar figures prevent this paradigm shifting treatment to be accessible for as many patients as possible.
Thank you. Cece?
Yeah, I'd like to use my semicolon.
How did you hear about this, the famous semicolon? How did you?
Dr. Sharita Golden said, one of the challenges in leadership that we have is doing what's right when the cost is high. And so as we think about these numbers and considerations, I'd like us all to remember that there are people at the other end of this whose lives will be impacted tremendously.
Thank you very much. Elle?
My hope is that all patients who want to be cured will one day have the access to be cured. And so at the end of the day, let us remember the patients themselves, that this is the hope that they've dreamed about for years.
Thank you very much. Jimmy?
I don't think there's been enough done to bridge the gap between the sickle cell or the African American community and the medical community. You could take a look at COVID, for example. More people of color died per capita. And that is because a lot of people saw their neighbors dying and they didn't want to get vaccinated. I think in order to get accessibility, we need to bridge that gap.
Thank you all so much. You were supremely effective and helpful policy roundtable. I apologize that we were only able to obviously touch on certain issues and even there not probably go as deep as we could. But we covered a lot of territory, and the basic perspectives and insights that you provided were incredibly helpful. I hope you can stay on for just the last 15 minutes. The CTAF members will go around and have their one sentence closing. And part of that will also be a chance to thank you. But let me hand it over to Rena to do that, and then I'll have a very last word at the very end.
Great. Well, this has been a fantastic meeting. I'm hoping our CTAF members can turn their cameras back on, and we will go around for everyone to have a closing comment. Let's see, I will start with Ralph. Ralph, are you on?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My sentence: shared decision-making between patients, family, and healthcare providers will be of paramount importance if the FDA approval occurs later this year. Appreciating the present lack of robust data surrounding gene therapies assessing safety and efficacy over a significant longitudinal timeframe, ideally 15 years. With this concern in mind, collecting robust patient data in patients receiving gene therapy in a sickle cell disease registry should be viewed as a mandatory requirement in all patients.
That was fantastic. Thank you, Ralph. Bob?
I usually make a comment kind of in the face of patient advocate groups. I'm glad I don't have to do that today. I would appreciate a little acknowledgement to Praveen, who actually got it right today, where most clinical trials information gets it wrong. Patients do not fail treatments, treatments fail patients. And on that subject here, I'd like to suggest that we're moving into a territory here where this isn't gene therapy, it's getting very close to gene fixing, which is further along the road than we thought we might be when we started using the term gene therapy. Pretty fast here, and we will fail the patients if we don't get them access to these things when they're available.
Thanks, Bob. Since we're going alphabetically, I'm next, and I just really want to call out the patients and caregivers who spoke on this call, which I think really took the whole discussion to another level. Everyone on the call has contributed, but I vividly remember my first patient in my residency in sickle cell crisis, and how that was just a recurring theme of seeing patients suffering and feeling very powerless. And I'm hopeful that we are moving in the right direction. I just want to acknowledge everyone's contributions, but most of all, the patients and caregivers today. Next is Kim.
Yeah, I echo and thank you for joining us today. The patients were wonderful. I think my ask would be that we create a registry for all gene therapy, and that it's stratified by indication to monitor for adverse events and downstream unanticipated consequences, including new emerging inequities.
Thank you, Kim. Paul Heidenreich.
Yes, as someone who typically advocates for randomized trials, I'll just say this remarkable therapy comes as close to a parachute as anything we have seen to date.
Thank you, Paul. Jeff Hotch.
Thank you. I just wanted to say that I'm grateful to the patients and caregivers, the clinical experts and presenters of other evidence who helped our committee's assessment of the clinical evidence, where we worked hard not to let perfection be the enemy of good enough. And I sincerely hope that good enough is not the enemy of safe enough. Furthermore, in terms of the economic evidence, it'll be interesting to see how the findings from the value research done by Drs. Thokala and Calhoun play out in the real world of scarce resources, opportunity costs, and competing priorities.
Thank you, Jeff. Jeff Klingman.
Yeah, this is very exciting times that we can now look into cures for things that we had terrible treatments for. I would just put out a plea to the manufacturers that to some extent pricing is access, and I think the decisions can be around pricing if they're informed around benchmarks such as really Dr. Calhoun's paper or the ICER recommendations, make it a lot easier. I work to say yes. I work in a integrated organization, and what we've noticed is when the pricing, even if very expensive for a drug, is sort of felt to be in line with these sort of recommendations, it's a lot easier for our panels to look at it and say, yeah, this is probably the right thing to do, and not feel so bad about it. And this is such an important thing for equity that I just make a plea for taking a look at those recommendations when you set the prices.
Excellent. Joy Melnikow.
So I'm going to take two sentences. First, I just want to say thank you to everyone. I've been on CTAF for a long time, and I think this is the best meeting I have attended in terms of the input and the breadth and the depth of the information and discussion. So thank you. And then my comment is this. I think if we want to do something about systemic racism in medicine, treatment for sickle cell is a very good place to start. And doing this right will require more than just providing access to these gene therapies. It's also going to require improving care, access to care, which is comprehensive for everyone with sickle cell. And I'm sad that CMS is not here, because I think many, many people with sickle cell have their care covered by CMS. So that's another hurdle that will have to be crossed. But I am hopeful but worried that the past is the best predictor of the future. So I'll stop there.
Mm-hmm. Elizabeth Murphy.
Yeah, I think as we've discussed, there's a lot of unknowns about the durability and the long-term safety of these treatments, especially around the CRISPR technology, as this will be the first. And in general, I'm a glass half empty kind of person, and yet what I'm going to go away with from this meeting is hopefulness. I'm really hopeful that there's this amazing new therapy. I'm hopeful that folks are going to work out the pricing and make it available to as many patients as possible, given how transformative and life-changing it is. And I'm also hopeful that whether it's because of step therapy or other things that will be on the road to getting this, that there will be a renewed emphasis and focus on care for sickle cell across the board. And hopefully there'll be downstream effects that'll help improve care for all the reasons that everyone's talked about, and the huge need for that.
Thank you. Catherine Phillips.
Yeah, it's clear that we need everyone at the table. And it was so good to hear patients and clinicians and yes, payers. But I totally agree. We need Medicaid at the table. And what about the uninsured? Let's don't forget them.
Anne Raldo.
I know there's still a lot to learn in the future about these therapies and the health-related quality of life that patients are going to have long-term. But if we wait for phase 3 randomized trial evidence for every indication, we're not going to get very far in medicine. So I am really grateful for these therapies and the advancements that have been made. I do wish, a girl can dream, that there was some way to make myeloablative conditioning regimens less toxic. But ultimately, I hope that these life-changing therapies will be priced fairly and distributed in a fair and equitable manner so that the people who need them the most are able to access them.
Thank you. Rita Redberg.
Thanks. Well, I'll certainly echo. I think it was great discussions. It's great to have the evidence, the experts, the patients, and the families of patients and insurers. I do hope. I mean, I'm optimistic, but I'm a little sad that we had to have this discussion with so little evidence, no randomized trial, and I just don't think we've had very good luck on getting data after FDA approval and widespread use. We don't see it, and this time we didn't even get it beforehand. So I hope it's all the things that we hope it's going to be, but there's clearly potential for harm too. But I think it was a great discussion, and everyone is trying their best to do the right thing.
Mm-hmm. Alex Smith.
Building on that comment, in academics, we worry about the least publishable unit and the harmful side effects of the least publishable unit. And with these small studies, I worry about the smallest and shortest follow-up FDA approvable study.
Thank you. And finally, Joanna Smith.
So I guess I agree with Jeff's comment wholeheartedly that pricing is access. And I found it incredibly moving to hear, particularly from the patients themselves today. Jimmy, don't ever underestimate the effect of what you can say, because it affected all of us today. But I think we've opened a door, and now we're going to have to deal with all of the issues of the complexity of delivering this service. Treatment.
And that's it for CTAF. I'll turn it back to Steve.
All right, thank you guys. Wonderful comments. I couldn't agree more with the praise for Jimmy and Elle and the other members of the Policy Roundtable. I have a few personal reflections, and we'll wrap up probably just on time. First off, it is a shame, but we had this whole meeting, and obviously we didn't have time to talk about gene therapy outside the United States. There is a whole world out there that has a lot more sickle cell disease than in the United States. I was at a meeting in London where they pointed out that more children are born with sickle cell disease in 1 year in Dar es Salaam than have sickle cell disease in the entire United States today. And And there was a person at that meeting who stood up in front of Europeans and Africans and said, there is no way that I envision gene therapy being provided to Africa by the West. They just don't think it's going to happen. They're going to continue to suffer and not have access to the treatments, the cures that we will have. So there's a huge, huge ethical, financial, all the other issues obviously intersecting, but I'm sorry we didn't have time to touch on that because it should be part of our ethical window that we all try to look through when we think about these issues. And so I have another quick story, which is I was at an earlier meeting that we held on cures, potential cures, and I asked a question. I said, what is special, if anything, about cures that we should look at them differently in terms of fair access or fair pricing? And a woman raised her hand. She was a physician, and she said, there's one difference. We have to give them. We have to make them accessible. We can argue about all the rest of them, but if we have a potential cure for a serious illness, we have to do this. And by the we, she really meant we, all of us. And it creates a sense of an still unwritten, but a very real social contract that we should hold each other accountable to, because we do not want payers to haggle at the table over, access criteria. And I'll cover it, maybe if that's our system, but we don't necessarily want that same paradigm applied to a cure for sickle cell disease. So we have to figure out what else we need to do. I've got 3 don'ts. First is, I hope that we are not myopic about this, that somehow all the rush and excitement about gene therapy leaves out all the other aspects of care for people with sickle cell disease and their families, so that we keep a broad view of what they need and can benefit from. The second is, I have a lot of faith in the private market, but I don't think we should assume that the private market is going to get this right. The tools they have are still very immature to deal with these very high cost things. The ways to stretch out prices are very, very challenging to implement. And drug makers and payers, many of our payers, are driven also by their shareholder fiduciary responsibilities. And the idea that we can expect that system to get access and affordability right for something like this when we have to give it, I'm not sure that we should just assume that that's somehow going to muddle through. And we might have to really be aggressive in holding companies to account, at leaving a very short leash, and at recognizing that sometimes regulation, when private markets aren't working right for patients, is the right thing to think about. And kind of allied to that is this last issue, which is, as much as we want to see these treatments created and made available, and therefore we value them just for that, and also for the historical aspects of racism and discrimination, I don't think we should view that as a blank check to the pharmaceutical industry or to payers to suck money out of the system. That money should get plowed back into the communities where that harm has been done. And so just because we might value this more should not mean that we accept ever higher prices. It needs to be viewed as an ecosystem in which that extra value gets integrated into that community in a way that's meaningful to them. And I think we can do that. We just have to keep our eye on the ball and not assume that usual practice will get us there. So thank you again to everybody who's attended this meeting. I know it's late on the East Coast, but I appreciate everybody there and on the West Coast. CTAF, you are a wonderful, humane, thoughtful, brilliant group of people, and you matched our policy roundtable with the thoughtfulness and the insights that you brought to the table too. So with that, we will be producing a final report within the next few weeks, and we will be keeping our eye on this space, if you will, as I hope you will, because we all have a lot of work to do to make sure that we do this right for patients. Thank you all, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.